Jazz, the soloist dream and child of New Orleans. But what is it about the swinging beats that made this music so popular? Jazz was considered a new conception of music. Until the invention of jazz in the mid-1800s, syncopated rhythms were not very popular among music writers. Jazz has been traced to being invented in the South by African Americans. This surprised many Southerners of the time because most slaves were denied the proper training to use musical instruments. The largest subgenre to jazz when it first originated was ragtime, which was mostly improvised. Because the popularity of jazz was so low when it was first thought of, fewer musicians wanted to perform it, making the bands have as few as 6 people. Instruments used in the beginning of jazz were trombones, cornets, clarinets, guitars, violins, upright basses, and a formation of percussion pieces, including a snare, bass, and the occasional cymbal. While jazz was new, its popularity was low. Yet by the 1870s, minstrel troupes and brass bands were touring America. By this time, jazz was very popular in southern cities like New Orleans. In the 1920s, the bigger bands such as the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, the Jelly Roll Morton Band, and the King Oliver Band came out with the new smoother pieces of jazz. This smoother style of ragtime is what helped to bring jazz icon Louis Armstrong into the jazz universe. His presence and solos in turn helped create the famous Chicago style in the late 1920s. This spring in the new jazz subgenres caused the 1920s to be nicknamed the Roaring Twenties. During the 20s, society came up with several dances which at first were considered immoral. These dances included the Charleston, the shimmy, and the tango. These dances added more movement of the torso than older dances. The music of the 60s, known for its lilting feeling, got its influence from blues, which is a subgenre of jazz. Syncopation to this point in history was not a very popular concept in music. After being tweaked for its uses in classical and folk music, syncopation had found its way into the hearts and ears of much more of the American population. Syncopation is the playing of a longer note off of the beat. The use of syncopation can be found even in today's music. Swing, which normally has a mid to fast tempo, was created in the 1930s. The emphasis of swing music is based off of the beat and often has a lilting feeling. Big bands were becoming more and more dominant in the 1920s and on. Big bands are composed of 12 to 24 musicians, giving it a bigger sound. A common jazz chord is the dominant 7 chord, also known as the 5/7 chord. When played, these chords show dissonance between the notes, but composers later found out that the chords can resolve well when played in a certain order with other chords of the key signature. This is an example of a chord with dissonance from the Count Basie chart for Lena and Lenny. This visual was meant to show why the 5/7 chord became popular among music writers. The black line across the screen represents the G major chord, which is the 5 chord of the key of C. At the same time, the vertical yellow line is meant to represent time in music. The G major chord consists of 3 notes, G, B, and D, as shown on the treble clef at the top of the screen. While the notes F and G alone are not aurally pleasing when played at one time, when F is played with the G major chord, it gives the chord a bit of tension, which is then released by usually the 1 chord. Other genres, such as modern country and folk, have taken their own construction from jazz. Bluegrass, a subgenre to country music, is a hybrid between jazz and country. While today's jazz has not changed style-wise, the experimentation of jazz is still at an all-time high. Today, most solos are done by the leading or lowest part of each section. Some groups may even try duets. Big bands are still the most common. Most of the instruments being used have stayed the same, but electric instruments like guitars and electric basses have changed the sound of jazz from the original upright bass and acoustic guitar. The saxophone, a common jazz instrument, was invented before the introduction of jazz, but was not introduced to jazz until the turn of the 20th century. In conclusion, was jazz important to modern music? Yes, because it gave us syncopation, it gave us tension in chords, it gave us just the presence of famous soloists, it gave us popular dances from in the early 1900s, and modern music styles.